Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 18. In this chapter we're talking about industrialization and the rise of big business, which also leads to American consumerism. So the book offers this picture. I thought I'd include it here just to call attention to the electrical building, which was built in 1892 for the World's Columbian Exposition included at the Chicago World's Fair. This included displays from General Electric and Westinghouse, the big power companies of the day. So this was really the first time that people had seen electricity used in powerfully functioning exhibits. Before, they'd seen electricity work, but they hadn't seen it work for them. So this was a big deal, and it really impacted the nation's ideas of what electricity could do for the country. And here's your timeline. We'll be talking about all of these people: Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Carnegie, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison. We'll also talk about the Haymarket Square riot and the Homestead Steel Strike in this chapter. Inventors were very important in the 19th century. Inventors in the late 19th century flooded the market with new technological advances. Encouraged by Great Britain's Industrial Revolution and eager for economic development in the wake of the Civil War, business investors sought the latest ideas upon which they could capitalize, both to transform the nation as well as to make a personal profit. These inventions were a key piece of the massive shift towards industrialization that followed. For both families and businesses, these inventions eventually represented a fundamental change in their way of life. Although the technology spread slowly, it did spread across the country. Whether it was a company that could now produce 10 times more products with new factories, or a household that could communicate with distant relatives, the old way of doing things was disappearing. Communication technologies, electric power production, and steel production were perhaps the three most significant developments of this time. While the first two affected personal lives and business development, the latter influenced business growth first and foremost, as the ability to produce large steel elements efficiently and cost-effectively led to permanent changes in the direction of industrial growth. Inventions, especially electricity, drew people away from farms and into factory work. From 1880 to 1920, the number of factory workers quadrupled and urban population doubled. There were a number of inventions that came from this era. The typewriter improved the written communication. Cash register in 1879 improved business and merchants' work. The adding machine in 1885 gave convenience of adding many sums. The vacuum cleaner was developed, and that improved cleanliness. A flush toilet was developed during this time period too, which improved living conditions and meant people no longer had to rely on outhouses. Tin cans, you don't think about them much, but think of the great improvement to food storage they offered at this time. It also made shipping a lot cheaper. So tin cans were a big deal. Also, the idea of frozen food. Clarence Birdseye, and I included a picture here of a Birdseye product. We eat a lot of this in my house, not gonna lie about it. It's quick, it's easy. I know the nutrition value because I can read it easily on the label. And Clarence Birdseye actually stumbled upon this when he was watching people fish in the Antarctic. If you go to the company's website, you can read his whole story and about how he thought, gee, these people are freezing their fish right away. Surely there's a way that we can quick freeze things and preserve them. And that's what his whole company is based on. Also important in this era is the Bessemer process of steel processing. Henry Bessemer developed this. It actually created large furnaces that made steel quicker and cheaper. So it was more cost effective to produce because in these large furnaces you could melt more of it for use. In 1860, the country produced 13,000 tons of steel. By 1879, American furnaces were producing more than 1 million tons of steel per year. By 1900, this figure rose to 10 million. Just 10 years later, the U.S. was the top steel producer in the world at over 24 million tons of steel produced annually. As production increased to match the overwhelming demand, the price of steel dropped by over 80%. When quality steel became cheaper and more readily available, other industries relied upon it more heavily too. And that included construction and later on, as we'll see, developing the automotive industry. As a result, the steel industry rapidly became the cornerstone of the American economy, remaining the primary indicator of industrial growth and stability throughout the end of World War II. There were several inventions that had a positive impact on communications during this time frame. In 1858, cable lines were run to connect Great Britain and the U.S. Communication took just a few hours instead of just a few weeks to manually send letters by steamship, across the ocean. These initial cables didn't work for very long, like about a month, but people immediately began trying to find new stable ways to communicate worldwide. By 1878, there were more than 100,000 miles of cable connecting all continents. Now, this cable obviously ran underwater. Western Union controlled 80% of the U.S. telegraph lines. So at this point, we're still talking about telegraph cables. I guess it's important to mention that because the phone doesn't come around just quite as part of that just quite yet. But it is in the same time period. Alexander Graham Bell patented the phone in 1876. He was not the first to develop it, but he was the first to harness the capitalization of it. So he created the National Bell Telephone Company. Western Union turned down his idea, but they commissioned Thomas Edison to invent an improved telephone. Then when Edison did that, they were kind of afraid that maybe they would get into some legal trouble or at least massive lawsuit with Bell. So Western Union sold Edison's improvement to the Bell Company. Bell Company became known as the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which if you look at the acronym of that, it's a name you probably recognize today just as AT&T, so company still in existence. By 1880, there were 50,000 phones in use in the U.S. By 1900, that was 1.35 million. Today, think about it, we walk around with phones in our pockets or purse. This is an image of Alexander Graham Bell's patent of the telephone. It was one of almost 700,000 U.S. patents issued between 1850 and 1900. That's a lot of patents developed in that 50-year time. I think I've mentioned it to you before. Sometime, when you have a free moment, just take a look at Google Patents and search by your hometown or by your last name or something, just to get an idea of the number of inventions that are just out there. You can even search by time frame if you'd like to, so you can see the different inventions that were developed. Although the patent itself was only 6 pages long, including 2 pages of illustrations, it proved to be one of the most contested and profitable patents of the 19th century. And as I mentioned, Bell was not the first to invent this concept, but he was the first to capitalize on it. We know Thomas Alva Edison primarily for his invention of the light bulb, which he invented in 1879. But Edison was quite possibly the greatest inventor of the turn of the century, saying famously that he hoped to have a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every month or so. He registered more than 1,000 patents, actually it's 1,093 patents, over his lifetime. He became interested in the telegraph industry as a boy, and then he worked on trains selling candy and newspapers. Soon he became tinkering with the telegraph technology and by 1876 had devoted himself to full-time lab work as an inventor. Then he proceeded to invent a string of items that are still used today. These items are the phonograph, the mimeograph machine, the motion picture projector, the dictaphone, and the storage battery, all using factory-oriented assembly line processes with financial backing largely from financier J.P. Morgan, who we'll talk about in a little while. So these things, I mentioned that these things are all still in use today. Obviously, we don't call them the same things. Phonograph, Today we listen to music digitally, but we definitely know about storage batteries and movie projectors. A mimeograph machine would have been an early copier. George Westinghouse was one of Edison's competitors. Westinghouse made electric lighting available nationwide by inventing alternating current power. Edison used direct current power, and direct current, or DC power, could only extend 2 miles from the power source. So AC power could be much farther away from the power source. So Edison proclaimed that the AC power would actually be the best way to power the new electric chair. He was hoping that by associating Westinghouse's power with something deadly, that it would create a negative public image for AC power. But the truth of the matter is, it was just more cost-effective and more efficient for homes and businesses to use AC power. Eventually, he gave in and adapted to AC's popularity. Briefly mentioned the Chicago World's Fair from 1893 at the beginning of this presentation. That's when electricity had been demonstrated before, but had never been seen the way they would see it this year at the World Columbian exhibit. President Cleveland pushed a button and the whole display lit up. This was to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's journey to America. And note that I put that in quotes because we know Columbus didn't discover the U.S., which is the assumption that we tend to have when we say America. Despite the awe associated with electricity and the attention the World's Fair drew, the U.S. was headed for economic depression. Railroads were very definitely a big part of the economy at this time. After the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, it created rapid growth for westward expansion, and it created the need for more railway. It also created need for more iron, wood, and coal industries because those are the things that were needed to build and power steam engines. We also will be talking a little later on about Pullman, who created a passenger sleep car that improved travel for people. So railroads, as you can imagine, became big business. They got federal and state loans and grants to build, and railroads grew tremendously. They also attracted investors. So they became some of the wealthiest people in America by exploiting the system, which are the people who exploited the railroad system are called robber barons. These robber barons fluctuated shipping rates and charged farmers more, but themselves and their friends less. Jay Gould is one of these robber barons. He bought older, smaller railroads and made small improvements to them. And in the American West, which was really critical to get supplies to them and goods from them so that they could make money, in the American West, he forced farmers to pay whatever he demanded for shipping. And he owned Union Pacific Railroad, so he had control of 10,000 miles of railway track, which made it really easy for him to exploit shipping to make more money. Now, someone else who's considered in this time as not as a robber baron, but he was impacted by a robber baron, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. And you may recognize the Vanderbilt name. This is where their money came from originally. Vanderbilt cared about the success of his railroad and its positive impact on the American economy. He was one of these people who believed in philanthropy. He combined several smaller railway lines to create the New York Central Railroad Company. He bought stock in major railroads so he could connect to them, and by the end of 1877, he was one of the top 3 wealthiest people in American history. But Jay Gould, the robber baron that we just spoke of, cheated Vanderbilt by watering stocks. He issued unjustified stocks to make them look more valuable. So when Vanderbilt bought them, Gould and his cronies dumped the worthless stocks, which basically they just took Vanderbilt's money and ran with it. And this is an image of what I just talked about. It's called The Great Race for the Western Stakes, which was a Currier and Ives lithograph from 1870 depicting Cornelius Vanderbilt's rare failed attempt at further consolidating his railroad empire when he lost his 1866-68 battle with James Fisk, Jay Gould, and Daniel Drew for control of the Erie Railway Company. Andrew Carnegie is another wealthy person we see develop during this time period. Andrew Carnegie made his money in steel. So he came to the United States from Scotland as a child with his family. He worked in a factory as a bobbin boy as a teenager before becoming a telegram messenger. So as a telegram messenger, he spent a lot of time around railroads. He worked his way into management at the railroad, and a mentor there helped him invest in oil fields, which earned him $1 million, actually a little more than $1 million. So at that point, he began investing in steel. He made shrewd business decisions and was really thrifty with his profits. However, he insisted on up-to-date machinery and up-to-date equipment. He also urged employees to think of ways to increase production and reduce cost. So he valued their work and he valued their experience. He also believed that the wealthy had a moral obligation to society. He understood poverty. He came from poverty, and he felt like wealthy people had the obligation to give back, to help others who were in poverty or less fortunate. Let's move on now to John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was born to modest means. His father was a traveling salesman, and Rockefeller knew how to work. As a young boy, he helped raise money for his family by selling farm products like eggs, When he was in high school, he took some bookkeeping classes and developed a keen interest in business. So he takes a little of the money that he's earned over time and he starts investing it into crude oil. Now, most people at this time are investing in crude oil as far as the discovery of crude oil. But Rockefeller looks at it a little differently. He invests in the refining industry, how to refine crude oil. So he wants to see crude oil turn into kerosene, and kerosene quickly replaced whale oil for home and business use. So now that he's making money, Rockefeller creates Standard Oil Company. He's ruthless in his pursuit of controlling the entire oil refining industry. And he developed a monopoly. Monopoly is when the ownership or control, or monopoly is the control of all enterprises comprising an entire industry. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled almost 95% of oil refining in the U.S. and 95% of all oil refining in the world. It's a big deal. So not only does he have a U.S. monopoly, he has a worldwide monopoly. And if the monopoly guy in the upper corner didn't give you any ideas, that's a big deal. That's a lot of money. So Rockefeller created a trust. A trust is a small group of trustees that have legal ownership of a business that they operate for the benefit of other investors. This led to a monopoly. And speaking of monopoly, here's another board game called District Messenger Boy. It was based on a book by Horatio Alger, and the idea was that players could achieve success through the ultimate goal of material success. Alger wrote hundreds of books on this common theme of, rags to riches. So this game went right along with that theme. Okay, back to Rockefeller. So the Ohio Supreme Court said that Standard Oil must dissolve because it had a monopoly, which was an unfair business practice. Rockefeller changed the business model, to a holding company instead. So a holding company creates a central corporate entity that controls the operations of multiple companies by holding a majority of the stock for each enterprise. It wasn't technically a trust, but it still created a monopoly, so you can see the problem there. Other companies start following this model, and pretty soon 1% of U.S. businesses controlled 40% of the nation's economy. So while they couldn't stop it before more businesses started setting up their holding companies, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed to address the monopoly issues. We have another wealthy person from this era, J.P. Morgan, another name you might still be familiar with today. J.P. Morgan, unlike the other two we've discussed, was born into wealth. His father was wealthy. JP became wealthier as an investment banker. JP Morgan came to the United States to manage his family's investments here. He started his own company called the JP Morgan and Company Financial Firm. He bought and sold stock in growing businesses and was a huge success in doing so. So when he did this, he would buy stock in a business, and every time he did, he demanded a seat on the company board of directors in exchange for his investment in them. So it gave him a control in each of the businesses that he was buying stock in. Congress investigated his business as a money trust, which was more powerful than Rockefeller's trust. He contended that this kind of business provided stability in a hyper-competitive economy, though. So Morgan buys out Carnegie in 1901. He says, name your price, and Carnegie kind of scoffs. It's like $500 million. Not thinking that JP Morgan would take it, but he did. So Carnegie sells to JP Morgan for $500 million in 1901, and Morgan creates the U.S. Steel Corporation, the United States' very first billion-dollar firm. In 1912, JP Morgan's firm controlled more than $22 million in assets, and to put things into perspective, all the land west of the Mississippi River at that time wasn't worth that much. With all this industrial development, after the Civil War especially, we see lives really changing. In 1865, 65% of all Americans lived and worked on farms, but by 1900, only 40% lived and worked on farms. Better farm equipment meant that fewer farm hands were needed, so those people had to find work. They moved into urban areas and found factory jobs instead. The average wage at this time might surprise you. It was 20 cents an hour, which came down to about $600 a year. It doesn't sound like a lot, but we have to keep in mind the cost of their expenses of the time, the cost of living for the day. I know I found one of my father's W-2s one year from his taxes, and I think it was 1974. He was working as an elected county official, as tax assessor, and his salary was $7,900 per year. I could not believe that he supported a family of four on $7,900 per year because my mother didn't work. We had a new house, we had a new car, I had piano lessons, my brother had a car, all of the things that, people wanted, we had those things on $7,900 a year. So things change, prices change, costs of living change. So 20 cents an hour and $600 a year is where we were at this time. And people had more things than they'd ever had before. Now, one of the downsides to this is that the work conditions were horrible. They were not safe. In 1913, 25,000 people died on the job as a result of a work-related accident or work-related condition. 700,000 people had critical injuries that made them miss at least a month of work. Now keep in mind, if you had an injury, if you were lucky and you got hurt on the job, you died. Because if you didn't die, if you were just incapacitated from then on out or disabled so that you couldn't work, there was no help for you. You just flat out couldn't work. Your family had to find other means. And, 700,000 people in that year missed 1 month of work. We don't have the number for how many people got hurt and couldn't return to work. But factory conditions were horrible at the time, and there was a lot of this kind of stuff happening. Work tasks were broken down into small repetitive tasks. So it wasn't so much about creating a big product as it was creating a little part to a bigger product. And because of these small repetitive tasks, women and children were able to join the workplace. Women usually worked in clothing and textile industries so men wouldn't be distracted by them. Some women worked in clerical jobs, and women obviously were paid less than men, and that was mainly because they didn't see that women needed to earn a living wage because they were expected to marry someone who would take care of them. Now, I mentioned that children worked, so we do have some children working, especially teenagers at this point in time. And the photographer took this image of children working in a New York glass factory at midnight. Now they're kids. I mean, they might be 12, maybe 13, but still, it's after midnight. We didn't have the child labor laws in place then that we do now. So children were allowed to work around the clock in difficult and dangerous situations. They were almost seen as expendable. So as more and more people began working in factories and seeing these harsh conditions, they wanted to make changes. They were progressive. They wanted to improve situations. The Molly Maguires was a group that wanted to do that. They were a secret organization of Irish coal miners in East Pennsylvania. They wanted to bring attention to the miners' plights. Now, they did this the wrong way by kidnapping people and beating them and killing people. So obviously, not the best way to get your point across. By 1875, detectives had the names of 24 suspected Maguires. All of them were accused and convicted of murder and violence against property. So they were all convicted. 10 were hanged in public in 1876. So the Molly Maguires definitely had the wrong idea in terms of how they went about, kidnapping, murder, that sort of thing. Really bad idea. But organizing gave some other people some thoughts, which led to the creation of the National Labor Union in 1866. The National Labor Union wanted equal rights and equal pay for African Americans plus women. They wanted currency reform, and they really wanted an 8-hour workday because at this point people are working 12 to 16 hours a day. The 8-hour workday was adopted by the federal government, but no one else at this time. The Knights of Labor came along in 1873. They had a broader base than the Maguires, and they were open to everyone. The Maguires were Irish coal miners. So this is open to everyone, all genders, all trades, all skills. They also supported the 8-hour workday and equal pay for all. And by 1886, their membership was more than 700,000 and growing. And this poster, you can see it's written in both English and German, is inviting people to the Haymarket mass meeting that we'll talk about on the next slide. But the Knights of Labor popularity started falling after the Haymarket affair in 1886. What happened was there had been a strike and police killed a protester, one of the working union members who was in protest. After that, anarchists protested in Haymarket Square in Chicago. The protest was quiet, but police were ready for conflict. Someone in the crowd threw a bomb at police, which I would argue, isn't exactly a quiet protest, but anyway, someone in the crowd threw a bomb at police and killed one officer and injured another. The 7 protest speakers were arrested and charged with murder and sentenced to death. 2 were pardoned, 1 committed suicide before execution. So the fact that these protest speakers were arrested and charged and convicted of murder and sentenced to death was a really quick way to make people not interested in getting involved in something like the Knights of Labor. Now, again, these were anarchists who were protesting in Haymarket Square. They weren't members of the Knights of Labor, but because it all started as the base of the Knights of Labor strike, where police killed a protester, the Knights of Labor were blamed, and they caught all of the bad publicity for it. So their membership fell. The benefit of this, though, if you can pull a benefit out of here, is that the Knights of Labor did show potential for unions. And here's an image of the Haymarket affair. And here's another union. You might be familiar with this one today. the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. The AFL now, today, is known as the AFL-CIO, but the AFL was started by Samuel Gompers in 1886, and it grouped together 20 different craft unions. It focused almost all its efforts on economic gains for members and very seldom got involved in political issues other than the ones that were directly related to their work conditions. They had this policy of not interfering in each union's individual business as well. By 1900, it had 500,000 members. By 1914, 1 million members. And by 1920, 4 million members strong in the AFL. The Homestead Steel Act of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1898 also crushed the labor movement for the next 4 decades. The Homestead factory of Carnegie Steel Company is the source of the Homestead Steel Strike. Carnegie was in Scotland and left his factory manager named Henry Frick in charge to negotiate with the union. He got frustrated and Frick locked out the workers and hired other people to take their place. So he stopped negotiating with the union and hired people to work in their place. As the new workers arrived, they were met with gunfire from the union members, which obviously created really bad publicity for the union. The state army escorted in the strike breakers, which defeated the union, and then it left many union members unemployed. Many of them were asking for their jobs back. The Pullman strike in 1894 came after some tough business decisions that Pullman made in 1893. So the Panic of 1893 was the depression of that era. And Pullman, in order to try to keep his business afloat, cut his workforce from 6,000 to 3,000 people. So he cut his workforce in half. He also cut wages for the 3,000 people who he kept on. Now, Pullman created this whole town situation for his employees so they could live in the same town. They had access to stores and grocery stores that charged credit based on their jobs. And so he cuts the wages for these 3,000 people, but he doesn't cut the price of their rent or the prices that they're spending in grocery stores in this little town that he created to serve his employees. So the workers went on strike on May 11th. Eugene Debs was president of the American Railway Union, and he ordered all union members to stop working on Pullman cars and to stop handling any train that had a Pullman car on them. So that created a national railroad block. To make it a government concern, President Cleveland ordered a mail delivery car attached to each train. So since then, the mail couldn't be delivered, it became a federal issue. And he sent troops in to make sure the mail was delivered. Debs refused to call off the strike and was arrested for tampering with mail delivery, which is a federal offense, and the AFL lost respect in the public opinion. And you can see in this photo here of the Pullman strike of 1894, the Illinois National Guard and striking workers faced off in front of a railroad building. I want to shift focus a little bit now from the factories to the consumers. The rise of big business turned Americans into this consumer culture. We wanted time-saving tools and we wanted leisure commodities. People were shopping in stores and by mail order. There were big department stores that developed during this time. Macy's, who we all know hosts the annual Thanksgiving parade still today in New York City. Gimbel's is a similar store based in Philadelphia. And then in smaller towns, we had stores develop like A&P and Woolworths. The Store Window Journal by Frank Baum, who you might know as the writer of The Wizard of Oz, explained how to decorate shop windows for promotion. Also, Montgomery Ward was the first significant mail order business in 1872. And then Sears and Roebuck and Company formed in 1886 and started a massive catalog business. With so many choices, advertising becomes crucial. Newspapers sold full-page advertisements instead of the little ads that they'd originally sold. So to describe this to you, the ads that they usually sold, newspapers are divided into columns, like say 6 columns wide, And an advertisement would just be typeset into a column width. And there might be a little divider line before the next one, but they were all pretty much the same, sort of like our classified ads look like today, but all run in a column and separated by a story sometimes, or just simply by a line. But consumer culture then makes advertising also a business. Buying on credit made it possible for just about everyone to buy, which means we also have a culture of debt developing too. And last but not least, I wanted to show you a picture from an old Sears and Roebuck catalog. So you can see that this organ, which looks very ornate, was available for sale from Sears and Roebuck for $27.45. It's the Queen Anne parlor organ. The pedals at the bottom are pump or indicate that it's a pump organ. So you would have to push your feet to get air up into the organ in order to force the sound out. There are keys that you would play on a regular piano. There are knobs that you would pull in and out depending on how you wanted the sound to be. There are small areas at the kind of around the midsection of the organ where you would set kerosene lamps to play by so you could read your sheet music better. And I think it's really neat that this beautiful ornate organ is $27.45. So just as a personal story, my great-grandmother bought an organ similar to this. It's not exactly like this, and it did not come from Sears and Roebuck, but she actually paid $20-something was the best of her recollection back a long time ago when she was talking about it. $20-something, and she paid it off to a store in Point Cedar. So if you know where Charlie Knight's store was in Point Cedar, you know where my great-grandmother paid off her organ. And we still have this organ in my family. So it's kind of a neat take, and I'd never seen an advertisement for a similar organ before. So I thought this was really pretty neat. And those of you who've never seen a Sears and Roebuck catalog, now you've seen a page from one.